Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Fadi Zatari. I am a research fellow at Center for Islam and Global Affairs in Istanbul. I am happy to welcome all of you to our new book discussion. Today we are honored again to host Dr. SherAli Tareen, who is Associated Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College in the USA. He will be presenting his book, Defending Muḥammad in Modernity. Furthermore, we have two respondents, Dr. Ma'raj Din and Dr. Yasmin Saeb, who are both research fellow at Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Dr. SherAli will present his book in around 30 minutes. Then each respondent will have around 10 minutes to comment on a specific part of the book or general observation. Professor SherAli, it's good to welcome you again at SIGA. Please, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Dr. Fadi, for your generous and kind introduction, for your invitation, and to Dr. Meraj and Dr. Yasmin for your time, and of course to Dr. Sami Al-Aryan. Wonderful to see you again. It really is an honor and pleasure to be at SIGA again, and I just want to congratulate you on all the wonderful work that you're doing and the great events that you're hosting. It's really a great honor for me to be here. So what I plan on doing in the next few minutes is to present some aspects of the broad arguments of this book, Defending Muḥammad in Modernity, that came out almost exactly 2 years ago in January of 2020, and to talk a bit about the larger stakes in terms of not only its intervention in the study of Islam, the relationship between Islam and modernity, but also the larger humanities and larger questions of politics that this book might speak to. So to give a broad introduction, this book primarily is an exploration of the religious thought and debates of some prominent South Asian Muslim scholars, especially the traditionalist scholars or the ulama of 18th and 19th century South Asia. Specifically the geography of northern India, which was one of the most intellectually fertile regions and still is in the context of not only South Asian Islam, but modern Islam, more broadly speaking. And I looked at a particular intra-Muslim debate, which continues to hold massive implications and consequences, not only for South Asian Muslims today, but in fact for diaspora South Asian Muslims all over the world, in the West, in the places like South Africa, the UK, the US, Caribbean, etc. And of course, online also, this debate is very avidly fought out even today. So although this debate began in the late 18th and 19th century, its reverberations, its implications for questions of how one defines blasphemy, the practice of everyday life, different questions to do with Muslim ritual life, such as the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, very cutting and difficult theological questions, such as the capacity of God to produce another Prophet Muhammad or to renege on his own promise. These were very sort of difficult, or the question of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, ilm al-ghaib. So these theological and legal questions, or questions also of everyday life, continue to hold massive implications for everyday life even until today, not only in South Asia, but all over the world. Primarily, before I sort of describe more the individual aspects of the book, let me just state at the very beginning the larger take-home point, or the larger sort of intervention that I've tried to make in this book. In a nutshell, what I've tried to do in this book is to rethink the question of the political and try to show that Muslim actors, and especially the traditionalist ulama, even when they're engaging in debates that might seem to revolve around questions that are arcane or irrelevant to the conditions of modernity, such as, debates on ritual practices like the celebration of the Prophet's birthday or the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown. Can God lie or not? Can God produce another Prophet Muhammad or not? Prophetic intercession. These different theological, legal questions that might seem to modern sensibilities as either arcane or irrelevant to conditions of modernity, were in fact deeply political. But they articulate a vision of politics that is not restricted and that is not exclusively centered on the modern state or on processes of electoral democracy, but rather they articulate a vision of the political that have to do with the curation of a moral public, that have to do with the practice of everyday life, that have to do with what the embodied life of the community should look like in conditions of modernity. And these are deeply political questions. So my main intervention or main argument that I wanted to make was that we need to rethink the political in ways that are not centered on the modern state, in ways that, although these debates and polemics, of course, happened under the shadow of the modern colonial state, and they continue to happen under the shadows of the post-colonial state, in places like Pakistan, elsewhere, etc. But the vision of politics that they articulate and on which they rest exceed the sovereignty of the modern state. So that was the underlying argument that I wanted to make, that these are very sophisticated. There are some very sophisticated political theories at work in these seemingly arcane theological and legal discussions and debates. So in some ways, the point of the book is to show the complexity, the tensions, the ambiguities, the depth, as well as the staggering diversity of Muslim intellectual traditions or Muslim ulama traditions, with one theater being its focus, that of modern South Asia. Although I put modern South Asian scholars in conversation with pre-modern Muslim intellectual traditions, primarily Hanafi legal traditions, and also with sort of some modern Middle Eastern intellectual traditions at different points in the book. But the focus is on Muslim intellectual scholars who wrote interchangeably in Arabic, Urdu, and Persian. And these are the three sort of languages that I work with over the course of the book. Now, let me come to the specifics. So what was this debate? Who are these scholars, etc.? So primarily, this book focuses on this intra-Muslim polemic that is known as what is called the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic, which refers to two groups of scholars who were among the most influential, most prolific, and arguably the most towering scholars of modern South Asia, who were both Hanafi legal scholars and major Sufi masters from different Sufi orders. And I try to show how these intra-Muslim debates that sort of begin in the late 18th and early 19th century and are contested between different individual scholars at that time period, as colonialism in South Asia becomes more encrusted, as colonialism takes a stronger foothold in South Asia, how these individual-based intellectual disagreements and doctrinal polemics take on a more group-centered orientation by the late 19th century. So in some ways, historiographically, one of the key arguments of the book is it is trying to tell a narrative of how the consolidation of British colonial power in modern South Asia corresponds with and runs parallel to the intensification and the intensification of the group identities of different ulama outfits in South Asia. And they take on this group-centered orientation and this new category, which itself is not new, but takes on a new meaning in South Asia, called masalik, the singular maslak, which of course comes from the Arabic suluk and the idea of ethical, virtuous practice. But in the context of South Asia and in the Urdu register of late 19th century South Asia, it takes on the meaning of competing groups of Muslim scholars, competing masalik, all contesting each other on the question of what should be the normative life of the community. So that's one aspect, the historiographic aspect of the relationship between the consolidation of British colonial power and the emergence of group-centered orientations when it comes to these intra-Muslim debates and polemics. Now, the main theme of this debate and that of this book is this. I was interested in the question of, as Muslims in South Asia lose their political sovereignty after the fall of the Mughal Empire, and as we see the ascendance of the British colonial power, how does that lead to, and how does that generate the conditions for debates centered on the status of theological sovereignty, God's sovereignty? In other words, with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, how does the question of theological sovereignty become center stage for these scholars? And what led me to this kind of a theoretical framing is that we clearly see that it's really in the 19th century that these debates become especially vociferous. They become especially contested. They become especially intensified by the 19th century. These debates on the Prophet's status, the question of, what should the everyday life of the community look like, which rituals and customs are heretical, which ones are not, which ones are, under the category of heretical innovation, bid'ah, which is a key category of the book, especially its second half. So I was interested in the question of why does it all happen with such intensity and with such ferocity in the late 19th century or over the course of the 19th century. And my sort of theoretical hypothesis that I've presented in this book is that it really is a context of the loss of political sovereignty that generates the conditions for an intensified focus on the question of divine sovereignty. And the relationship of divine sovereignty to prophetic authority, how should one remember the Prophet's memory and his authority, and how that relationship then informs how Muslim scholars imagined the practice of everyday life when it came to different rituals, practices, etc. So it is this relationship between these three different categories: divine sovereignty, that we can think about as Tawheed, or there are other categories also that come throughout the book, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, that have to do basically with God's capacity to announce the exception, or God's absolute power. So divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, the Prophet's charisma, his authority, what persona, what notion of the Prophet's authority should one have, and then the practice of everyday ritual life. The relationship between these three categories, that's what I called a political theology. And my main argument in the book, the main sort of point I make in the book, is that the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic was a reflection of competing political theologies, where there are two groups of scholars who have different understandings of this relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday ritual life. On the one hand, now let me explain what the argument is, and I'll have to do that very briefly. The details are in the book, but I'll do it briefly to give you the sort of the nutshell of the argument. On the one hand, there was a group of scholars who later on take on this name of Deobandis after the establishment of an Islamic seminary in the northern Indian town of Deoband in 1866. And before that, there were individual scholars who articulated this position, but not in a group, not under a group identity, not under a group name, so to say. Their argument was that in the conditions of the 19th century, when Muslims have lost their political sovereignty, divine sovereignty is under grave threat. How? Their argument was that it's not as if people have become declared agnostics or atheists, but rather because of the proliferation of different ritual practices and customs in terms of everyday life, that has compromised divine sovereignty. How? Let me explain their argument. Let me do that with one particular example. So let's take the example of perhaps the most contested ritual in Muslim South Asia that I spend a lot of time discussing in this book as well, which is the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, the Mawlid, which is widely practiced in Muslim societies and has been practiced for many centuries. So their argument was quite nuanced, and it was not that this is a reprehensible practice at all. They in fact said it's a commendable practice, it's a means to exalt the Prophet, and it can only be a commendable practice for that reason. But their argument was that Indian Muslim masses are engaging in this practice with such intensity, with such passion, with such regularity, with such discipline, that these practices have begun, like Mawlid and others, there are many other practices, that these practices have begun to simulate obligatory practices of the religion, like praying, fasting, etc., that have certain prescribed order and prescribed regularity and discipline attached to them. So, according to the Sharia, of course, these practices are under the category of simply permissible practices, or mubahat. So their argument was that the intention and the discipline and the regularity and the passion with which the masses are engaged in these practices, which are seemingly spiritually pious, they are beginning to confuse them for the obligatory practices of religion. And through that confusion, they are undermining God's sovereignty, because these prescribe boundaries between the permissibles and the obligatory practices and that which is forbidden, these values of the Sharia. Of course, the sovereign author of these values is God. So this is how they correlated divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life. According to them, it is really in the perfection of the Prophet's humanity that we found the perfection of his prophethood. That is what made the Prophet a perfect being. So they also had a notion of prophetic love, but that emphasized his humanity over anything else. And that emphasized that one should maintain a distance, a separation between the obligatory practices of religion and these permissible practices of religion and so on. So this is one political theology. So their whole notion, the political theory that they articulated then, was that in this world of moral chaos and corruption, in which Muslims have lost their political sovereignty precisely because of this moral sluggishness, our job as reformers is to awaken the masses, awaken the people, so that they understand their responsibility to distinguish the obligatory practices of religion from the permissibles. And if they confuse the two, we need to stop that. So that was their sort of nuanced argument in terms of critiquing these everyday ritual practices and customs. And that's how theology, law, and everyday practice connected with each other. Now, on the other hand, the other group of scholars, the Barelvi scholars, named after the town of Bareilly, where the founder of the school, a Muslim polymath scholar called Ahmad Raza Khan, he was from that town in North India. That's why it's called the Barelvi school. His argument was that that the relationship between divine sovereignty and prophetic exceptionality, the exceptional status of the prophet, is mutually constitutive. It's really by affirming the exceptionality of the prophet as the most beloved of God's beings, as the ultimate center of cosmic gravity, that you confirm divine sovereignty. In other words, his argument and their argument was that divine sovereignty and prophetic authority cannot be separated from each other. So they vigorously defended rituals and practices that served as a means to exalt and venerate the prophet, like the prophet's birthday celebration and other practices, etc. And through that, we see a competing political theology, which is based on the mutual constitution of divine sovereignty and the authority of the prophet as the most beloved and the most exceptional of all beings in the world. So from that position, they defended practices like celebrating the prophet's birthday. They defended the prophet's knowledge of the unknown and other such theological sort of and legal questions. Now, the important qualifier here is that even someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi school, it's not as if he was okay with everything that the masses did, that the public did. He was deeply critical of the way in which people engaged in ritual practices on the ground. He was also a reformer. So this is not a debate between reformists and anti-reformists. But his argument was, again, a very nuanced argument, which was that if some people are considering the permissible practices of the religion to be obligatory, and that's how they're engaging in their religion, your job as scholars is to correct that mistake. Your job is not to ban the ritual altogether by calling it bid'ah or heretical innovation, but rather your job is to correct and purify the corruptions which have entered into the intentions and the practice of the masses. But on the other hand, for the Deobandi scholars and their predecessors in the early 19th century, the level of corruption had reached a level that the situation was terminal. The only way to address the situation was to cut off the means to any moral corruption. And the category that they invoked from Hanafi jurisprudence was this idea of blocking the means, saddo daraya. So that was their sort of competing argument. So here we see a very nuanced intra-Muslim, intra-Hanafi debate on the question of how we should think about the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life. I'm leaving out a lot of details here, but I'm just trying to give you the gist, or one of the gists of the book. And my main point in trying to show the complexity of the ways in which they make these arguments and the construct these arguments on this question and many other questions that I try to go into throughout the book was to interrupt and disrupt some common stereotypes about this particular intra-Muslim debate, and through that, interrupt and disrupt broader Western secular framings of traditions of intra-Muslim debate. So let me end my comments, last 5 minutes or so, to talk about some of the stereotypical ways in which this debate is oftentimes approached. in especially Western policy circles, think tanks, and even oftentimes even in Western scholarship, as I show in the introduction to the book. So there are three main stereotypes about this polemic that we see not only in Western sort of framings, but by this point even people in Muslim countries, especially sort of the liberal secular elite, has sort of absorbed these ways of looking at this polemic and ulama traditions more broadly speaking. So one common stereotype is that, as I mentioned earlier, that this polemic has very little to do with conditions of modernity, that these were arcane debates on questions that have nothing to do with conditions of modernity, and they belong to a specialist group of scholars, and it's irrelevant to our own lives and so on, and they don't really articulate anything that goes beyond the nitty-gritty and the kind of theoretical gymnastics of the specialist group of scholars. So that's one stereotype. This is irrelevant. Second stereotype is that it's too controversial. They discuss questions of the prophet. Can God produce another prophet or not? Can God lie or not? What's the status of the prophet's knowledge of the unknown? What is heretical innovation or bid'ah? So it's so controversial that let's just leave it aside. This is a very prevalent attitude in South Asia today, that these are specialist scholars and their debates. We should not get involved in it. Best to stay away from it. The third and the most dominant stereotype that we find about this debate, and in regularizing it, or in sort of cementing it, there is a longer history of Orientalist scholarship. But more recently, after 9/11, what ended up happening was that after 9/11, in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other places, even India for that matter, there was this Western sort of drive to find moderate Muslims and moderate Islam all over the world, right? So we all know that one of the key aspects of this whole discourse of moderation and moderate Islam was the kind of caricature and the privileging of Sufism to be the moderate kind of Islam, the soft kind of Islam, which was then distinguished from the sort of apparently harsh or exclusivist and Puritan kind of Islam connected to the Sharia or banner bearers of the Sharia. So this kind of good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative with which I begin the book in the introduction was very much applied to this particular polemic in South Asia, the Deobandi-Barelvi polemic, whereby the Barelvi school was misread as this, sort of exclusively Sufi school, although of course their masters and their scholars are, major Sufi masters and scholars. But it was misread as being this kind of a soft kind of Islam because they're okay with things like celebrating the Prophet's birthday and shrine visitation, etc. So let's, fund them, let's privilege them, and let's sort of patronize them so that they can be a bulwark against these so-called exclusivists and Puritan Muslims, the Deobandis, because some among the Deobandis loosely connected, were also connected to the Taliban, etc. So in that kind of context, this was the kind of good Muslim, bad Muslim framing which was applied to this. And we saw the construction of Sufi universities in places like Pakistan and elsewhere and so on and so forth. So this is one of the most common stereotypes about this polemic, that this is a polemic between Sufi Muslims and Muslim legal scholars. And this you find not only in Western sort of think tanks and their documents, and I show sort of documents that were written by the Heritage Foundation, the Rand Corporation, etc. in the early 2000s, which go right into this kind of a stereotyping of the Barelvis are the soft Sufis, the Deobandis are the hard Sharia protagonists. The main problem with this kind of framing is that the scholars of both these schools were major Sufi scholars and scholars of Hanafi law. So it's not as if they woke up in the morning being mystical till the afternoon and then switched to a legal persona in the evening. That's not how complex scholars and their lives work. The other major problem is, and that's what I show throughout the book, that this is a singularly inept and politically insidious framing of this intra-Muslim debate and polemic. This was not a debate between moderates and extremists, between legal scholars and Sufi scholars, between modernists and traditionalists, but rather this was a sophisticated intra-Muslim debate that had competing readings of the Islamic legal tradition and competing understandings of what should Islam look like and what should Muslim normative practice look like in conditions of modernity. And both of these groups of scholars articulated competing visions of the Prophet, competing visions of Prophet Muhammad, and competing visions of what his life and what his persona and memory should look like and how it should inform the practice of everyday life among the community. So both of them had pastoral concerns about their community and vigorously fought and engaged in a very sophisticated intra-Muslim debate that had competing conceptions of the political, competing political theologies. So the larger politics of this book, in some ways, is a critique of liberal secular framings, and especially binary framings, when they divide and compartmentalize Muslim scholars into the Sufi scholars and the legal scholars, the moderates and the extremists, the modernists and the traditionalists, the good Muslims and the bad Muslims, to try to look at the internal logics of these debates. And that's in some ways the take-home point, the conceptual take-home point of this book that I think connects it beyond South Asia. And it's a call to look at the sophistication and the internal logics of intra-Muslim debate. That could be ulama debates, it could be other debates, that articulate understandings of politics that exceed the sovereignty of the modern state, and where we can locate the political in unexpected places. And this is where I'm indebted to the scholarship of scholars like the late anthropologist Sabah Mahmood, who tried to show ways in which the choreography of everyday life and the question of embodied everyday life is in fact deeply political. And that insight I try to apply to this particular case, in which I don't do an ethnography here, but I look at how two groups of the most prominent and influential ulama of South Asia had competing visions of the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and the practice of everyday life, or competing political theologies, to make the case that we have a certain understanding of the political at work here that we will escape and that we will not recognize if we have a very limited understanding, or a very sort of exclusively liberal secular understanding of what constitutes the political. So that in some ways is the underlying thrust of this book, and the underlying objective, which is twofold. One is to provide readers with insights about how these scholars can be put into conversation with Western theoretical discussions on questions of sovereignty, political theology, everyday life, etc. So in some ways, this book is what I have imagined as a contrapuntal engagement between the Western and Muslim humanities, to show that these Muslim scholars can speak back to Western theory as well. And that in some ways is a decolonial sort of potential of this book, I would like to think. But more broadly, to offer a way to look at intra-Muslim traditions of debates in ways that advance our understanding of politics, and which is not restricted to an exclusively liberal secular understanding of politics. The last thing I would say is that, one critique that one might offer is that maybe I'm generalizing, or the idea of liberal secular framings. I understand secularism and secular power takes on different forms, takes on different trajectories in different contexts. But underlying the idea of secular power is to moderate and regulate and manage religion in a way which is conducive to an understanding and definition of religion that corresponds with a modern secular Protestant notion of what is good religion, through which it then looks at other actors in different parts of the world and imposes its own binary framings onto otherwise very complex actors. So although this debate unfolded under the shadows of modern secular colonial power, and there are places where the scholars themselves have imbibed certain categories of modern secular power, but nonetheless, if you look at the nuances of their positions and their logics of their arguments much exceed the tentacles and the grasp of liberal secular conceptuality. And that in some ways is the underlying conceptual point that I want to make through this book. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. This is amazing. I'm not expert in this topic, and I learned a lot of things, and I hope through the discussion we get more details. Before I give the floor for Miraj, I just will ask you just one maybe example, because you already mentioned the Mawlid al-Nabawi as one event that as a daily practice affecting a lot, and it has a lot behind it, because we're seeing this as just a celebration. We don't see how we connect it to modernity. Can you maybe give another example, one or two examples about different things in the practice? Because this is for me something, because we have something called informal institutional theory, and maybe you are aware of this. This is something related to this, maybe, because informal institution theory, it's about the practice, the behavior of the people in the society, and how that affect the real institution, because informal institution that will lead to impact on the formal institution, and that will affect everyone in the society on the collective level. I need maybe one more example besides this.
I'll give one more example, and that will actually help me further clarify the competing positions at work here. So I'll give you the example of perhaps what was the second most contested ritual. And I should clarify here that over the course of the book, it's not only ritual practices that I discuss, but theological issues that I've also mentioned here also receive quite a bit of attention. But the second ritual that I will talk about is a ritual which is seen in many different Muslim societies, but perhaps it's quite dominant in South Asia even today, which is that on the third day of someone's death, or the 40th day of someone's death, it could be a sort of an ordinary person, or could be a Sufi mystic, anyone, or a death anniversary. Food is distributed among the people in a neighborhood, especially the destitute people, the poor of the neighborhood. Now, this ritual is called the third Siwam, because it's usually on the third day that food is distributed. So again, the Deobandi scholars' position, and before the Deoband pioneers, the scholars who sort of articulated a position similar to them, which they then further advanced, their position was that this is an excellent practice that becomes a means to feed the poor, and the idea is that by feeding the poor and doing an act of charity, the rewards that you get from it are then transmitted to the soul of the deceased. Hence, in Urdu, it is called Isal Sawab. Isal Thawab is what one might call it. So, but their argument then was quite interesting. They said, although it is a commendable practice, the intention with which the masses are now engaging in this practice is not so much to feed the poor or to do an act of charity, but to show off their wealth. But to and they're so committed, they're so attached to the specific form of this ritual of how the food will be distributed, that they must raise their hands in front of the food and then say the Fatiha over it, the first chapter of the Quran, and they never change the form. They do it on that specific day only, the third. They would not do it on the fourth or the fifth. So their argument was twofold. One is that when you do something so specifically, which is not among the obligatory practices of religion, it begins to simulate religious obligations when you're doing it on the third day in this way. Have to distribute this particular food to this particular kind of people, etc. And so hence it simulates the obligations of the Sharia. Again, that kind of argument about simulation. And this is not specific to South Asian scholars, by the way. The great 14th century Maliki jurist Ibrahim Ash-Shatibi, in his famous and really one of the most important books on bid'ah in early modern Islam, Al-I'tisam, he had a very similar definition of bid'ah, which is that practices of religion that begin to that are otherwise permissible but begin to simulate obligatory practices of religion. So this was an argument that was then also articulated by the Deoband scholars. But their other major point in this, in talking about this ritual was, and this is where I think things get quite interesting, that because this ritual has been around for so long, that people have forgotten and lost sight of the original purpose of the ritual. And they have instead become absolutely attached to the specific form of the ritual, rather than the purpose of the ritual. And that attachment to the form has led to bad intentions like affectation, showing off of wealth, etc. So they saw their role as reformers to intervene in this history, which has become so sedimented, which has become so sort of layered with the passage of time, that people have forgotten the purpose, and to awaken the masses and to make them understand what the purpose of the ritual was to begin with. So that was their position, and hence they called it a bid'ah in that particular context. So their argument was that although in and of itself, this ritual is commendable, like the Mawlid. So that's a very crucial part of the Deobandi argument that people oftentimes forget, that in and of itself, fi nafsiha, it is absolutely commendable, these practices. But it's because of their entanglement with corruptions of both intentionality and in terms of simulating with obligatory practices that they have now become corrupted and have become bid'ah. The opposing point of view of Ahmad Raza Khan was that, now here he really did differ from the Deoband scholars in a very substantive way. His argument was that if they specify a date, the reason for that specification of a date is to ensure the continuity of the ritual. So if they do the Mawlid on a particular date in Rabiul Awwal, that's because so that to ensure the mudawama, the continuity of the ritual. It is by specifying a date that everyone will know that this is supposed to happen every year. So his argument was that as long as these kinds of specifications, these takhsisat, fulfill a particular kind of welfare for the community, a particular maslaha for the community, they cannot be categorized as heretical. And if there are some corruptions that have entered into it, that people are spending too much money or they're acting in affectation, then you correct those corruptions, but you cannot object to them specifying a particular date, for example, tawqit al-waqt, because it is through the tawqit al-waqt that the mudawama, or the continuity of the ritual, is ensured. So he was much more willing to give the masses some benefit of doubt, and so that the continuity of these rituals is ensured over time. But for the Deoband scholars, the situation had reached such a terminal point, had reached such a point of moral malaise, that the only way to morally purify and correct the practice of the masses was to cut off the means to this corruption. So that's another example.
Now it's clear for me. Okay, thank you very much. Merajuddin, Dr. Merajuddin is a research associate or research fellow at Center for Islamic and Global Affairs. Yes, the floor is yours.
Nothing to leave. I think after SherAli, nobody can say much and nobody can add much to what he has already said. But nonetheless, I have written a few things about the book as well as the context of this whole work. So before I contribute my few cents to the thought-provoking and intellectual engaging work of SherAli, I would attest the humbling and proud fact that the new scholarship, especially emerging on South Asia from within Muslims, roughly over the past 4 decades, starting from Muhammad Qasim Zaman up to SherAli Tareen, is no less than the resurrection of the emic from the epistemic hegemony of Orientalist ethic. This new scholarship, including the present one, is a discursive formation at the intersection of several fields like history, political science, religious studies, anthropology, sociology, and South Asian studies that re-evaluates earlier academic conversations in distinctive ways to make several paradigmatic moves. A, rethinking and problematizing the political, particularly the theme of sovereignty, which SherAli beautifully discussed. In pre-modern period, colonial modernity, and then post-colonial South Asia. B, complexifying the study of constructs such as Muslim religious identity and authority by attention to textuality, embodiment, and internal criticism. And finally, unpacking the ethics, theology, and politics of translating ulama's life worlds in their own words, so as to resurrect the emic from the epistemic generalizations of Eurocentric scholarship. And I think his book is the best manifestation of that response. While the history of Islam and Muslims in South Asia can be told in several ways, however, the most glaring problem we face when attempting any sort of genealogical reconstruction of its history is that we often speak and read through the language and tools that is offered to us by secular modernity, thus inhibiting any sort of sustained critique. SherAli's book, I believe in this case, needs no introduction and undoubtedly is one among many significant steps to disrupt the above-mentioned epistemic conundrum. Tareen also very effectively uses key debates and discourses from the Western canon, including on sovereignty, on the distinction between potentiality and actuality, and numerous others, to examine 19th century phenomenon in the South Asian world. The salience of sovereignty as an analytic to study the question of the political in ulama life worlds is most rigorously argued in SherAli's Defending Muḥammad and Modernity. His book, if read carefully, does a contextualist reading of internal logic of intra-Muslim positionality on various issues of significance, as well as problematizes and questions the Eurocentric scholarship's stereotyping and labeling of Islam in South Asia on many levels. Now, coming to certain questions which are relevant even to my project, I'm trying to trace the question of Muslim other in the early 20th century in South Asia and trying to find the genesis of Muslim otherization in South Asia. So SherAli Tareen chooses the comparative political theology within the Muslim world, within Muslims. So why intra-faith comparative political theology? Taking this discussion to other important terrain may untie many knots for researchers like me who are interested in the thematic disciplines touched in this book, whether that is secularism, sovereignty, political theology, or secular modernity. Tareen writes, in both the salvific and social domains, a hierarchical arrangement of power was imperative. Moreover, exaltation of the Prophet as the highest cosmic and ontological reality was the ultimate template for such a hierarchical political theology. My question and interest lies in his interest and use of intra-faith competing political theologies. I wonder What prompted this intra-faith political theological contention at the time when there was a parallel political theological disputation unfolding between Hindus and Muslims after the fall of Mughal Empire and incursion of a new metaphysics of colonial modernity? Do you see, as I asked, do you see this as an escapist route or failure of ulama who were clueless on how to respond to the British colonial onslaught in a Hindu majority? Also, as you trace the genealogy of binaries like exclusive, inclusive, Sufi radical, moderate radical, Sufi fundamentalist, to secularism, as you argue somewhere else, the whole aim of the liberal secular thought and power is precisely to compartmentalize Muslim life in a manner which will be palatable to liberal secular framework. Is there any historical records within ulama tradition which shows any resistance to these enforced binaries? Do you think the scholars you engage in your work or in the larger Muslim intelligentsia in South Asia during modern colonial period were forcibly thrown into this conundrum and were mere recipients to these enforced binaries? And moving on to the question of secularism and the question of tolerance, as we know, the promise of tolerance comes with a condition of transformation. As we observe, Muslims as minority communities in Europe or Asia will only be assimilated, recognized, accepted, and seen as equal citizens only when they shun their Muslim identity and move towards secular logic and submit to the will of majority. But what do you think about the assertion that Muslims in South Asia during the timeline you have chosen for your research have readily and unquestionably accepted the conclusive normativity of colonial modernity? Do you see any sustained resistance and attempts to disrupt this project of colonial modernity in that period of South Asia? So these are just 2-3 humble points. I have written at least 8-10 points which comes in line with my project, and I would really would love to hear your comments on these points. And your work has really given a new direction to the research in the field of South Asia. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Miraj. This is a good contribution. Please, Dr. SherAli, you can have like 10 or more even minutes then we can move to Dr. Yasmin.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Miraj, for those really excellent comments and questions, and for your kind words. I'm really humbled, and thank you very much for those. So let me very briefly and hopefully as clearly as possible address your primary question that you've asked about these ulama actors and their relationship to colonial modernity and its structures and its sort of power dynamics. The first thing I would point out is that this particular book, of course, looks at one specific dimension of ulama thought in South Asia. I mean, it looks at it quite extensively. It is a book touching almost 500 pages, but still it is a very specific aspect of their thought to do with these questions of theology, law, everyday practice, in which I was interested in putting their logics in conversation with theoretical conversations coming in the Western Academy on questions of sovereignty, political theology, everyday practice, as you correctly pointed out. But these same scholars and the institutions that they belong to, of course, have other discourses as well, in which you might find their engagement with structures and discourses of colonial modernity even more directly, although you do find instances of that even here. So, for example, to answer your question, I will actually draw a bit on my current book project that I've just finished up. It's under review right now, called Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire, which looks at intra-Muslim and intra-ulama debates on the question of inter-religious friendship, specifically Hindu-Muslim friendship. There, if you look, for example, we see examples of the ulama much more directly engaging with categories. I'll give you an example. I've mentioned this before, perhaps, as well, that, when these debates happened in the context of the Khilafat movement exactly 100 years ago, when you had a group of Muslim scholars who tried to preserve the Ottoman Caliphate against British onslaught. And in trying to do that, they tried to make an argument for forging friendship with the Hindus and the Indian National Congress and Gandhi. When this position was opposed by someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, the key category that they used, for example, when it came to things like cow sacrifice, or that Muslims should not be forced to cease cow sacrifice under the pressure of the Hindu community or under the pressure of Gandhi, the main category that he employed was precisely the freedom of religion and the question of secular even-handedness. that we should not be compelled to seize our, a Muslim ritual, which is a Muslim marker of distinction, SherAli Islam, under the pressure of a non-Muslim community. So there we find a very interesting sort of way in which a Muslim traditionalist scholar is very adept and very flexible at instrumentally employing and mobilizing the very categories of colonial modernity to make an argument which then coalesces, which then connects to his larger argument, which comes from a certain kind of a Muslim imperial political theology, where he's trying to say that we need to preserve the sha'air, we need to preserve the Muslim markers of distinction, which comes from a certain kind of a Muslim imperial, moral economy. So these scholars were quite adept at times making it seem as if, when you read their texts and their discourses, as if there is no such thing as colonial modernity that is happening. When you, for example, look at the debates on can God lie, this is like back and forth on different kinds of questions of how do you distinguish potentiality from actuality, and how do you distinguish between mumtana bil ghair and mumtana bil dhat, and these very philosophical discussions. But then on other occasions, they're very adept at, mobilizing extracts from, the newspapers of the day, from court documents and legal judgments, these discourses and categories of freedom of religion. So my answer to you would be that the ulama, in fact, are quite adept and quite flexible in terms of finding different resources from different registers and different sort of categories. But having said that, that they're quite adept and quite flexible in terms of drawing on, colonial categories for their own argument, for their own case, oftentimes, we do need to recognize the power imbalance at work. And I think that's where your comment is quite useful here. That there is nonetheless is power imbalance, that the very terrain in which they're operating, is one that is not of their making. So we cannot romanticize these moments of creativity, these moments of flexibility, discursive flexibility, as some kind of an expression of native agency either, because the very conditions, the very terrain in which they're operating, the epistemic, political, institutional terrain, is a terrain which is not of their making. It is of the making of colonial modernity, to which they then get conscripted and then engage in their own arguments and their own sort of readings of the tradition. So in terms of looking at the relationship between colonial modernity and Muslim traditionalist discourses, ulama discourses in South Asia or elsewhere for that matter, but South Asia is a fertile theater because colonialism is so sort of immediate there in some ways. I think we need to move beyond, that's the argument that I make in the book, move beyond the very agency assimilation binary, by which I mean that while we cannot, undermine the very creative ways in which the ulama engage this new terrain in terms of their thought, in terms of their practices, and in very unexpected ways, they often use this new terrain. So they do, of course, engage in very creative interpretations of the tradition. So we cannot assimilate their thought into the very structure of colonial modernity. On the other hand, we should also go to the other extreme of saying that there are some, that they're completely agentive either. That the terrain that they have to negotiate is nonetheless not of their making. So we need to go beyond the agency assimilation binary in thinking about the encounter between conditions of colonial modernity and ulama discourses and debates in a way that is somewhat in the middle of these two extremes of the binary. So that would be my main sort of response to that particular argument. The other point that you made, and I'll very briefly touch on it, has to do with political theology and sovereignty. So very briefly, my main intention in terms of invoking the category of political theology was to do two things. One, in the Western academy, political theology has most oftentimes been used as a category to look at the theological underpinnings of the modern secular state, and to make the argument that as much as the modern secular state pretends to have completely eclipsed theology and older monarchies, nonetheless, its conceptual constitution very much borrows from the language of the theological exception, which is an argument, of course, which was most popularized by Carl Schmitt in his famous book, Political Theology of 1922. My main point in this book, see, this is my 22-month-old, he's just had breakfast. My main point in this book was to invert that problem space and to show how Muslim theological discourses and arguments also articulate competing political aspirations and imaginaries. So in some ways, not so much the political underpinnings of, not so much the theological underpinnings of modern secular politics, but rather the political projects and imaginaries at work in seemingly, ostensibly theological discourses and imaginaries. So I wanted to invert the problem space of the Western theoretical understanding of political theology. That's one. And secondly, what I wanted to show was that we have a vision of sovereignty at work here and a vision of politics at work here in these ulama discourses that, although does rely on the question of the exception. So, the whole idea of kharqul ada is very central to this whole idea of, can God produce another prophet or not? Or, prophetic intercession for that matter. It's an exception to the rule. So that notion of the exception does figure into Muslim theological discourses, but the notion of sovereignty at work here exceeds the exception as well and connects to the practice of everyday life. So I wanted to show how Muslim notions of sovereignty, Muslim ulama notions of sovereignty, both borrow from but also exceed Western understandings of what constitutes sovereignty, and certainly exceeds the conceptual hegemony of the modern state and its constitution of sovereignty. So that in a nutshell is what I try to do in terms of both borrowing from but also inverting the problem space of Western theoretical discourses on sovereignty and political theology. And that I think might be the best, in my view, that I've presented one possibility, one method of engaging in decolonial thought, this much sort of used category these days, much in vogue these days. I think the kind of inclination that if one wants to work decolonially, one should completely set aside or not engage Western categories and theorists altogether, I think is not very helpful. I think much more helpful is to show the relevance and the effectiveness of Muslim traditionalist scholars and logics in terms of how they can not only speak with, but also speak back to Western theory, how they can be engaged with, and how these Western theoretical discourses can be useful in deepening, in clarifying the thought of Muslim actors, for example, in this case, Muslim ulama in South Asia, but how the close investigation of the internal logics of Muslim scholars and the ulama can also show the limits of Western theoretical discourses and its contexts and histories. So I think that might be a much more profitable way of engaging in decolonial thought, rather than setting aside or rather than completely doing away with any engagement with Western theoretical discourses. So that, for me, is one method of decolonial thought that I try to present in this book, although I did not frame it that way. So thank you, Mehraj, for allowing me to explicate that in more clear ways.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we move to Dr. Yasmin, I just have one question. Like, how similar are the debated topics or issues are in other regions? Like, in other words, like, is this questions and debates between these groups and these scholars something unique to specific Muslim area, or we can have like generalization like about this similar to North Africa or whatever in different Muslim?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my answer would be that there are parallels, certainly, even not only in terms of the pre-modern period. Of course, these debates have a much longer history, going back to differences. When we look at, for example, the thought of someone like Ibn Taymiyyah on the Mawlid, compare that to Jalaluddin as-Suyuti or etc. There is pre-modern reverberations and precedents to these debates, obviously, that also become important to the logics of these scholars themselves. So one of the major Barelvi arguments against the Deobandis is that for much of Muslim history, including in the Hanafi legal school, most Muslim scholars commended these kinds of practices, especially the Prophet's birthday celebration. So who are you to have come in the 19th century and calling it bid'ah at this time? And they said that these scholars are under the influence of a certain kind of Wahhabi thought, etc., which was a polemical framing. They were very staunch Hanafis, Deobandis themselves as well. But the Deobandi counter-argument was that we are not calling these rituals heretical innovation in and of itself, but because of the particular conditions and manner in which the masses of India at this time are engaging in these practices. So their counter-argument was that if someone like Suyuti came to India and saw these Muslim practices, he would also call it to be heretical innovation. So the point being that it has precedence. But even in this particular time period, of course, there is a parallel debate going on between Hanafi scholars in Arabia and the emerging sort of Wahhabi school, etc. So someone like Ahmad Zaini Dahlan, the great Hanafi scholar of the Ottoman period, is very central to the intellectual constitution of someone like Ahmad Raza Khan. In fact, when they engage in these debates, the whole fatwa wars that happen oftentimes result in people traveling to Mecca and trying to get endorsements from the scholars in Mecca. And Arabian scholars in trying to cement their particular positions. So there are this very interesting, fascinating back and forth in which one group of scholars is saying that, they got your fatwas because they did not translate the text properly for you from Urdu to Arabic, and so on, back and forth that happens. So Arabia is a very, very central part of this debate also as it unfolds. So one of the most famous texts written by Ahmad Raza Khan called Husamul Haramain ala Manhar al-Kufr wal-Main, the endorsements that he got was from scholars in Arabia, and then after that you had the Deobandi scholars camping there and trying to get counter endorsements, etc. So the point being that the external sort of theater is very central to how it informs the South Asian context. But nonetheless, having said that, I do think there are some particularities as well in terms of how the debate unfolds, the languages that are employed, the going back and forth between Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and the kind of categories that become involved. So it has local flavors, certainly, certain distinct South Asian flavors, but the larger question and debate, of course, has a longer precedent and has sort of context outside of South Asia as well, that they were actively a part of, these scholars themselves. Thank you.
Okay, very clear. Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Yasmin Saad, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tareen. I really am fascinated with your book, and I have to say I learned incredible amounts of information that I was not privy to prior to reading it. I do have to admit that when I was requested to be a respondent to this book, and I had not read it at the time, and I read the title, I was completely, assuming that it was an entirely different topic, maybe something like an Orientalist response to their attack on the Prophet, or his, the prophecy, or the things that he did, so on and so forth, as a statesman, as a spouse, and so on. And so that's kind of where I thought the title was going. And I'm actually curious to get your response as to why you called it Defending Muhammad in Modernity, because in looking through the content thereafter, after having been assigned to be a respondent, it touches on so many different things that are not, of course, all of it could be tied back to
Dr. Yasmin, I have the same question.
You do? Oh, okay, good.
Why you select this title?
Yeah, because so I'm very curious to get that answer, but let me just kind of go through it and just give you a few of my observations. I really, you presented this comprehensive and theologically and theoretically also engaged work. Fascinated on this Barel v. Deobandi polemic that too many Muslims, I think, even within the academic space, are not very informed in, I would have to say, and it definitely adds a great richness to the academic and to the theological debate, for sure. I think it definitely needs to be more inculcated into mainstream. And I also was very interested to see the challenge of, the view of the different binaries, the mystical versus the legal, and the traditional versus the reformist. And I was wondering, as I was reading through, while on the one hand, we're doing these binary these competing binary understandings, by virtue of the fact that we're doing that, it's almost like we're, or you are, or the arguments that being posed is, it's almost like we have to almost define 100% unilaterally what legal versus mystical actually means, and whether mystical excludes legal or legal excludes mystical. And so sometimes, or traditionalist versus reformist, which does that mean that being a traditionalist does not mean that you can be a reformist, or if you're a reformist, you can't be a traditionalist. And so I was just very curious about that, because this, in a way, kind of builds into the argument that you also make so beautifully articulated in your book about this understanding of the Christian theology, where we take it from this idea of, you know, the problem of orthodoxy and the problem of calling something a sect. It sort of like goes along the same lines, where we're using different terminologies to frame what is normative and what is not normative. And, you know, in Islam, we don't have like a papacy where it's just like this one way and there's like, you know, everything is defined by that one way. And so I loved how you addressed that. And I was just curious how you were able to address these binaries in relationship to that. And also moving along, you know, I have always been fascinated with ilm al-kalam and Islam, you know, early Islamic theology. And honestly, I have to say, I drew so many parallels with your argument in the book with traditional, you know, kalam arguments. I mean, I was visualizing the Ash'arites and the Mu'tazilites going at it with each other over many theological issues of that time, that, you know, you fast forward into 18th and 19th century Islam, and, you know, whether God can lie or can renege on his promises, where one group says, well, no. And then the other group says, well, who are you to say no? God can do anything it wants. It may not do it, but it can do it. And so it's a wonderful debate that it's beautiful to see that, you know, 1,000 years later, a different flavor of it is definitely being quite engagedly alive, I think. And so I'm curious to get your feedback on that as well in comparison to traditional ilm al-kalam. And then also looking at my notes here, this idea of the purpose of the rituals, you know, so one group is saying, well, you really need to look at the purpose. And that for me is very much intertwined with what every person who studies fiqh, you know, jurisprudence and law has to first study maqasid al-sharia. So because the maqasid really drives everything. And I definitely saw a parallel of where they're coming from in terms of the isal, I don't want to use Arabic words, but the purpose of the ritual, then therefore, how does that make something, you know, conclusive or still sort of, you know, obligatory or actually, but I don't know. So my question actually in relationship to this is, I don't know that any one of them, I didn't get the sense from your book that any one of them said, well, if it is done with this intention, then it is haram or it is considered bid'ah. Because ultimately, it's supposed to be because honestly, I'll tell you, I'll give you a different example, because that particular argument isn't just for distribution of food on the third day. It could very well be the same argument for prayer. If you're praying in front of a crowd to show your, you know, your piety, then the purpose of that ritual, even though it's obligatory, can be deemed as bad too. So it can really technically be applied to every aspect of Islam, even the things that would be deemed compulsory, I would assume. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. And finally, you know, there's actually, it's not really finally, but I'll stop here. I know you called it sort of political competing political theologies. And you explained it to Dr. Mehraj about why you called it that. I'm still a bit curious as to why it was you referred it to a political theology, because it came at a time where there was a crisis in losing the political spectrum because of the colonialist rule. And in fact, it reminded me, I don't know how familiar you are with Dr. Wa'il Halaq, from Columbia University. And in one of his books, I think it was called The Introduction to Islamic Law, where he goes into many chapters of these case studies on how colonialism irreversibly impacted the understanding of Islamic law and practice, because of that. So I guess in a way, I was curious to sort of see, well, it's not really, could it have been you called it that because even colonial rule has shaped the way the Deobandi and the Barelvi thinking emerged at that time, because sometimes you have to understand something by taking it away. So if all things were equal and those two groups emerged where there was no colonialism, or it was a different kind of time frame, hypothetically, would that have been any different? And my associated and last question I'm curious about is, having studied these two polemics quite extensively, I'm very curious, if they were here today, these ulamas, how do you think or conceptualize theoretically their thoughts being, in 2022 different in terms of their arguments, 200 plus years ago? So fantastic subject. Love it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Yasmin. I really, first of all, want to thank you and Dr. Mehraj again as well for really your time in reading the book so closely and so meticulously. I realize the kind of time it must have taken. I really, really am honored and really want to thank all of you for that time. And for these really fascinating and excellent set of comments and questions to both you and Dr. Mehraj. So I'll answer your questions briefly one by one. The first question of the title. So the title came about with the sort of realization as I was researching this book that many of the questions that these scholars were debating, one way or another, centered on the Prophet. The question of prophetic intercession, Shafa'ah, which is part one of the book, the question of the Prophet, God's capacity to produce a second prophet, what is called in this tradition Imkan-e-Nazir, the question of heretical innovation against the Prophet's normative model or bid'ah, or the question of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, ilmul ghaib. So in some ways, the key legal, theological, ritual questions that were central to this debate, and that I spent most of the time in the book trying to explain and elaborate and show the internal logics, in some way or another centered on the figure of the Prophet. So why was that the case? Why is it that in the 19th century, the Prophet becomes this topic of this such serious internal contestation among these groups of Muslim scholars? All these debates, of course, have precedence in early Islam or in pre-modern Islam. But clearly something was happening here in terms of a certain way in which the Prophet was being imagined in different ways. And the argument that I tried to make was that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, and your question is very good because it allows me to re-articulate my argument in a slightly different way, that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, it's really competing imaginaries of the Prophet that becomes a synecdoche for how they understand a moral Muslim public. So their conception of a normative Muhammad, peace be upon him, becomes a way to sort of articulate competing notions of a moral Muslim public in conditions of modernity. So they're both defending different visions of what should a normative memory of the Prophet look like in conditions of modernity. And through that, they're trying to articulate what should a moral Muslim public look like in conditions of modernity. Hence, the title came Defending Muhammad in Modernity. The other sort of more stylistic reason is I wanted to try somehow to have a title without a colon. As you know, humanities people, we always have like colon and then something else. So I just wanted to see if I can do something more direct, one phrase. This is what came to my mind. I'm not sure if I'll be able to repeat that for my second book, but we'll see. So that's how the title came about. And I first had thought about making it contesting Muhammadan modernity, because they're contesting different visions, but that may have been, seen in a slightly different, or, it would have been misunderstood in places like Pakistan, etc. in the current context. So I wanted to call it Defending Muḥammad modernity for that reason. The academic context sometimes gets lost in different contexts. So that's answer to question one. Second question you ask is very interesting about binaries. And what I see you asking is that, what do we do? And you're asking a very interesting conceptual question, which is relevant, I think, not only to this book, but more broadly study of modern Islam or pre-modern Islam for that matter, which is how do you question and how do you critique these binary framings, or these that undermine the complexity of internal Muslim contestations? That's why these binary framings are problematic, even if though they can be heuristically useful. What do you do when you find the use of such oppositional, or rather different categories within the Muslim traditions of knowledge? So, within the Bareilly school, for example, they oftentimes call the Deobandis to be anti-Sufi, for example, or, that they are not being good Hanafi legal scholars. So when that very sort of law Sufism contestation is used within the Muslim discourse, what do you do then? And so the one sort of possible critique that one could make is that, these kinds of oppositions and these kinds of categories might be seen within the Muslim intellectual traditions and discourses. So why am I calling it some kind of a Western liberal secular binary? My response to that would be that the context of the two forms of discourse, and hence the two forms of power connected to the discourse, are very, very different. There is a world of a difference between the internal employment and mobilization or deployment of categories like a competing scholar being anti-Sufi within the context of an intra-Muslim debate, and the global politics of religion today, in which you have powerful think tanks and other sort of organizations bifurcating Muslims into good Muslims and bad Muslims, and undermining the complexity of internal Muslim traditions, and caricaturing something like Sufism as being opposite or opposed to Islamic law. So the two contexts and the forms of discourse and the logics of discourse are very different. But that is a challenge that I did nonetheless find in this book. And my argument is not that some of these scholars could not be critical of Sufi practices, like the Deoband scholars. Sometimes they were critical of Sufi practices, but the logics of their debates and their discourses on these questions is much more complex than one that can be captured by just calling it legal versus mystical and so on. So thank you for that question. Yeah, your third question, I think, points to one limit or one sort of shortcoming of this book, which is that although I do try my best to connect these discourses and these debates to pre-modern and sort of Muslim intellectual traditions beyond South Asia as much as possible, hence there is quite a bit of Arabic involved in this book as well, but perhaps I do that more so on these legal questions, or, with Shatibi and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, etc. But on these theological questions, perhaps I do it less so. I think for maybe reasons of space, or there is a way in which I perhaps was trying my best to, these are very complex debates, right? Can God lie? Can God produce second Muhammad or not? So I wanted to make it as clear for the uninitiated reader as possible, so that it remains accessible. Now, if I had gone further back to talking about the fascinating debates you're talking about, it may have made things a bit more muddled. So I think for that stylistic reason, if I remember correctly, I may not have gone into it. But you're absolutely right. They have precedents. But again, as I answered Dr. Fadi earlier, the precedents are there, but then they take on different South Asian flavors and different South Asian sort of kind of registers. So I think I absolutely agree with you, and you're pointing to an important shortcoming of the book. I think I could have done a bit more in terms of connecting these theological debates to these earlier Muslim intellectual discourses as well. The fourth question that you raised about colonialism again and political theology, there my brief answer would be, and you talked about Christian notions of orthodoxy and how that not being applicable. So your sort of main question was, again, how do we think about this encounter between conditions of colonial modernity and categories of Protestant Christianity and Muslim intellectual thought? And my brief answer to that is, and as I try to specify and elaborate at the end of chapter 5, the end of part 1 of the book, I think we need to make a distinction between the institutional and technological conditions of colonial modernity, like the printing press, new forms of sort of knowledge transmission, the railways, etc., that make possible these kinds of debates to become theaters of public contestation, that enables these scholars to even have a certain kind of a definable public that they can then address. So the technological and institutional conditions of colonial modernity on the one hand, I think needs to be distinguished from the epistemic conditions of colonial modernity that oftentimes does inform Muslim scholars. But as you pointed out with your Ilm al-Kalam example, the histories and the intellectual traditions that these scholars articulate and are a part of go much beyond the conditions of colonial modernity, that connect to a much longer history internal to Muslim intellectual traditions, which doesn't mean that we need to recover some kind of agency buried under the rubbles of colonial power. But I think we need to distinguish perhaps between the institutional and technological conditions of colonial modernity and the epistemic conditions of colonial modernity, which do inform but don't colonize the native, if I were to put it that way. They do inform but don't fully colonize. And it's really those rough edges that I'm trying to capture here. They do inform. These actors are playing their polemical game in a theater which has been marked and has been sort of structured by colonial power, but then they articulate a vision of politics and notions of the tradition that exceed the reach of that power. So that kind of rough edge is what I'm trying to capture by articulating their logics. And finally, the last point that you raised, which I did try to remember all the points, but the last one was very fascinating. What did you say the last point you had made, Dr.?
Well, I raised a couple of points. One was about Maqasid Sharia, but the last point is, how would the Deobandi Barelvi
today,
traditions have been different in the absence of colonialism, or today, for example?
Right. Yeah, I remember.
Hypothetically.
Yeah. So I'll briefly address each one. So in addressing the first question, I think that was very fascinating. You said about then prayer also becomes suspect, etc. So to talk about the Deoband scholars, they actually proposed an experiment to try to prove whether someone from the Muslim public is indeed understanding a permissible practice to be obligatory or not. The experiment that they proposed was that, say, 1 year, this particular Muslim in a particular neighborhood decides to abandon that practice. Just for 1 year, I'm not going to celebrate the Mawlid. Or for 1 year, I'm not going to distribute food in this particular way on the 3rd day. I'll do it on the 5th day. Their argument was, their experiment was that if someone does that, they will become the object of the rebuke and censure of their community. That the taboo of abandoning the practice would reach a level that they would become subject to the violence or the censure or the rebuke of the community. So if that happens, it shows, according to them, this was the litmus test. If that happens, it shows that they are making into an obligation that which is not obligatory. And the category that they employed was iltizam ma la yalzim. So they are becoming committed to something which, according to the Sharia, does not require any kind of strict commitment. So that's how they try to talk about this. But then the opposing argument is that as long as these practices are fulfilling some kind of maslaha of the community, and that sort of comes more to the question of maqasid, etc., we cannot call it heretical. But if there is a certain problem with their attitude, you correct that attitude. You don't ban the practice altogether. So that's a very nuanced difference that cannot be mapped into some kind of a legal Sufi binary or a modern traditional binary. Now to your last question, which also connects to a question that Dr. Fadi has raised on chat through a message about the relationship of this debate to the present, and how we think about this to do with the present. I'll say a couple of things. One is that this debate continues until the present. Of course, it has, as I said, it has only become more global. It has involved diaspora communities as well. Many of them may not even be familiar with these texts in their original languages. So it has taken on an English life as well online. But on the other hand, we've also seen some curious convergences between these different groups. So now to answer this question about the crisis to do with the Rushdie affair or questions of blasphemy. So the interesting thing is that in the current discourses around blasphemy, for example, in a place like Pakistan, different Deobandi and Barelvi scholars have sometimes come together in trying to resist the power and the pressure being exerted upon them from the modernist state or from a certain kind of Western sort of language on the question of prophetic honor. So there have been some convergences as well, that they have sometimes even come together, and new actors have come into the fold. So this very popular outfit today in Pakistan, for example, it's called Tehreek Labbaik Ya Rasulullah, which has become very popular and has a certain kind of street power, and has really, in some instances, led this whole discourse around blasphemy and prophetic honor and its defense, etc. They are a certain kind of a Barelvi outshoot, but they do not have the same kind of intellectual gravitas as that of the Barelvi founders like Ahmad Raza Khan, or the same traditionalist grounding and training. But they have sucked in to their discourses and their movement different Barelvi and Deobandi scholars. So the terrain has shifted a bit. But on the other hand, this debate still continues, and it is still an object of great contestation among not only scholars, but also more popular preachers and in terms of everyday life and so on. I think the main difference that we see today is that the openness and the kind of sophistication and the kind of extensive nature of this debate in the colonial period, we may not find it today when it comes to these very sensitive issues. For example, the openness and the extensive way in which these scholars debated the question of can God produce another Prophet Muhammad or not, I don't think that would be possible in today's climate. Or even debates on the Maulid, for example. The Maulid has become so popular and has become such a part of not only the sort of the populace, but even a certain kind of a sort of an elite has taken on this ritual as to be a marker of its elite status, or it has become so cemented in the everyday fabric of the community that having an active debate about is it a heretical innovation or not, I think will not be possible with the same kind of back and forth, with the same kind of extensive debate today as it was, for example, at that time. Or if it does happen, maybe not as publicly as it was. So I think the question of the Prophet's honor has taken on a certain kind of sensitivity. That I think is also connected with the further intensification of the crisis of sovereignty. As much as this crisis deepens, that we don't get to decide our own sovereign futures, but it gets decided elsewhere, the more I think the question of the Prophet will become more sensitive. So it's, I think, very interesting to think about notions of popular sovereignty and how that informs different kinds of sensitivities centered on the body of the Prophet. This kind of interesting combination between a certain kind of masculine certainty about an infallible prophet, but this understanding being combined with a constant threat of fragility, of trying to recover the lost sovereign power precisely through a more fantastical notion of an uncorruptible, infallible masculine prophet. So that, I think, relationship, I think, is quite fascinating to explore in the current context as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Yasmin.
Okay, I have a lot of a question, and this is the first time I think we do with two scholars commenting, so that time is very limited, but I have two questions. One, I do believe I agree with Taha Abdul Rahman that the core message of Islam is ethics, and as well as the core message of the Prophet Muhammad is ethical. So my question is like, how often these scholars and these schools debate the issue of ethics? For example, when we read Mawardi, for example, Adab al-Dunya wa Din, we will see he focus a lot on ethics, giving example, being sincere, for example. That lead to more trust in the society, and that lead to more social solidarity, and therefore something good to bring the people together. So this is the first question about the ethical rule. The second question, I'm sorry, I have a lot, but I will give one last. This school debated the issue of, as you mentioned in the beginning, they are afraid of the losing of the divine sovereignty. So what are the alternative would be in the case of the absence of divine sovereignty and the prophetic authority? And sorry, this will be the last two questions because of the time. And again, I'm sorry for, I get a lot of a question. I get from Awais also question. I'm sorry, Awais. But yeah, last two questions.
Thank you. And I just saw right now, always, that this the last question about the Rushdie affair was yours. Thank you so much for that great question. And you ask, I'll try to combine these questions actually of Uwais and Dr. Fadi that you've just asked as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Divine has been, yeah. Right. So I think what I would say is that these categories like sovereignty can, of course, it's a category which is malleable. It is a category which is capacious yet confusing. It is elastic yet elusive. And for that reason, it can be taken in different directions by different kinds of actors. So the question that you're posing here, Uwais, is interesting, because I do think that in a certain kind of Islamist political theorization of sovereignty and how the modern state is then sort of resurrected as a certain kind of, as you put it, access for a certain notion of sovereignty. I do think that perhaps that notion of sovereignty is not communicated in these discourses as clearly. And I think what is going on what is at work here is that, after the 1857 rebellion, as Muslims in South Asia are dealt a certain fatal blow, and the resurrection of any notion of sovereign political power becomes a foregone conclusion. And of course, many of these scholars, including the Deoband pioneers, are said to have even fought in that rebellion and what came out of it. The historiography is murky on that, but clearly they did something, because the main Sufi master of these scholars, on whom my last chapter of the book is focused, Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, had to flee India and had to live in Mecca for the last 42 years of his life. So clearly something was at work here. But after that event, I think there is a certain kind of realization that resurrecting Muslim political sovereignty is an impossibility. And I think that resurrection is what allows, interestingly, paradoxically, these set of Muslim scholars to then think about ways in which a certain notion of sovereign power, a certain notion of sovereign decision, a certain capacity for decision in terms of charting a moral, ethical life, to connect it to Dr. Fadi's question here, is only possible through the curation of a moral public and through the management and regulation of everyday ritual practices. So in some ways, the theater of everyday life becomes the underlying theater of the political. And the idea is that it is only through a certain curation of a moral public that any possibility of any notion of sovereign power can be recoverable in this particular moment. So that also connects to the question that Dr. Sami Al-Aryan is raising here about how they understood the question of the political and their understanding of jihad, for example. The interesting, curious detail there is that after the 1857 rebellion, there is a realization that the monstrosity of colonial power cannot be confronted with warfare. And hence, the India at that time, which previously had been categorized as a certain kind of Darul Harb by Muslim South Asian scholars and ulama, although the reasoning was that precisely the practices of Muslim life, Muslim ritual life, what they called the Sha'a'ir Islam, were not current anymore, and hence they had categorized it as Darul Harb. After the 1857 rebellion, there is a realization that any recovery of Darul Islam is impossible. And hence they come up with a curious middle category of Darul Sulh, the abode of conciliation, whereby as long as the British colonial powers allow everyday Muslim practices like praying, fasting, etc. to remain current, Muslims, can live under British sovereign power, and it will be called the Darul Sulh. And the focus of their energies and attention then turn to the Muslim masses and the choreography of their everyday practices. And so the very linchpin of how do you resurrect certain understanding of sovereign power in conditions when you have lost your political sovereignty gets centered on the everyday. Now, the important thing here is that not all Muslim scholars in South Asia abided by such a view. So, for example, the leaders of the Khilafat movement, who were also, some of them were really prominent Muslim scholars, like Abul Kalam Azad, or many Muslim scholars from this very important rationalist school of thought in South Asia called the Farangi Mahal school, for them, they still remained connected to and attached to a notion of the caliphate that they saw in the Ottoman Caliphate. And that's what that whole movement was about. So for them, Muslim ritual life, or the sha'air, the Muslim markers of distinction, like say cow sacrifice, etc., they have no meaning, they have no importance if the underlying source of the Sharia, Muslim political sovereignty and power, is not resurrected. And for that, interestingly, they saw hope in the Ottoman Caliphate. The interesting thing about that, though, is the Khilafat movement leaders themselves never argued that Indian Muslims should live under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Caliphate, but there was this kind of a symbolic notion of resurrecting a certain understanding of Muslim sovereign rule. And the opposing argument against them was then that, you're going to confront the British colonial power. Through that, you will further weaken Muslims financially, socially, economically, and we will become even more weakened. For doing that, you are erasing markers of Muslim distinction in everyday life, like cow sacrifice, etc. So here we find two competing visions of sovereignty, two competing visions of sovereign power, where one is locating it in the crescent of Muslim caliphal authority with the Ottoman Caliphate, and the other is locating it in the practice of everyday life, in maintaining dominance, in maintaining some kind of power over the non-Muslim other, in precisely practices like cow sacrifice and maintaining our mosques and our sounds in the public sphere, etc. So what we see here is how the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, in fact, paradoxically generates this tremendous intellectual fermentation on precisely where to locate sovereign power in these new conditions. And that in some ways then articulates a notion of sovereignty and sovereign power, which is not limited to the state, which also then connects to a certain ethics of everyday practice. Now, that ethics may not always correspond with a modernist ethic of how to deal with non-Muslims, etc., but it is grounded in an imperial Muslim political theology. But it nonetheless is a vision of the ethical which is important to take account of, to take stock of, that was articulated exactly 1 century ago, and until today, has massive implications, for example, in contemporary India, for example. So I'll just end on this note. In contemporary India, for example, many of the Muslim activists who have been critiquing the sort of Islamophobic Hindu nationalist state in India right now, they have articulated the argument that it is precisely the leaders of the Khilafat movement who try to say that no, Muslims should cease cow sacrifice to appease or to gain favor with the Hindu community and with the Indian National Congress in order to fight the British and resurrect Ottoman Caliphate. It's precisely because of that moment that today Indian Muslims have become subject to the violence and brutality of Hindu nationalism, where precisely things like cow sacrifice and the consumption of meat have become such a hot button issue, which has led to beef lynchings, etc. So they have tried to argue that the scholars who oppose the Khilafat movement, chief among them Ahmad Raza Khan of the Barelvi school, that they were up to something. They realized where this is heading. Now, even if one disagrees with that argument or not, regardless where you are in terms of that argument, it shows the very contemporary implications of these arguments that happened a century and a century and a half ago. So these are some immediate comments that come to mind in responding to 3 very fascinating and excellent questions by Dr. Owais, Dr. Samil Aryan, and Dr. Fadi.
Okay, thank you. Last question, please. I get this from Dr. Sami. So he's saying, understanding this school of fiqh or thought, are there any lessons we could draw that would inform us about the Taliban movement and rule? Please, just 1 minute or 1.5 minutes.
Yeah, let's take a minute. I think that in the case of Taliban is very fascinating because it combines a certain kind of, connection with the Deoband school and with Hanafi traditions of law, etc., but with a certain aspiration precisely for the curation of a moral public through the institution of the modern state. So there, I think in some ways also, to come back to Owais's question, the very sort of limits of traditionalism and Islamism can get quite blurry there. And I think the Taliban is an excellent example of that. And they can oftentimes be caricatured as just popular preachers, etc. But some of them have articulated some very sophisticated political theologies that I hope to get more into with reading some Pashto sources, etc. There's some very fascinating things happening with the thought of the Taliban and the ulama associated with them. But what they've done in very interesting ways is, one is that they have not, they have remained loyal to the Hanafi tradition, but they've taken advice and conversations and discourses from multiple legal schools and multiple scholars in the Gulf, etc., as well. But they have tried to combine a certain fidelity to the Hanafi canon while also thinking about how a model public can be resurrected precisely through the state. Whereas for the 19th century Deoband scholars, etc., The state, if you get it, that's excellent. If you don't have it, you continue the work of moral reform. And you continue the work of reforming the life of the community. The caliphate or the state is not a prerequisite for the work of reforming everyday practice and piety. And I think on that front, maybe there is a profound difference also between these 19th century actors and a movement like the Taliban. That would be my brief answer.
This is a lot of insight. Thank you very much. I am happy to host you again in SIGA, and thank you, Dr. Yasmin and Dr. Mehraj. Thank everyone, and inshallah, we will see you soon in Istanbul.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Inshallah.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure.